Hi. Solomon has dispatched all the people that his father David on his deathbed told him to dispatch, and others as well. And the narrator tells us, as you can see on the left side of the screen at the end of chapter 2, the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. So now we enter into the reign of Solomon, and it's very different than the reign of David in many ways. The reign of David was full of action and drama, and David's relationship with women and with Saul and all others. And Solomon seems to have almost no relationships with anybody other than the strategic ones as a king with Hiram of Tyre. And otherwise, he seems to have no relationships at all. He never goes out to battle, and he only speaks once, really, other than in the strange story of his negotiating a maternity suit between two street prostitutes as the only public act he engages in, other than the temple dedication. So there are many things about the Solomon story that are very different, and before we enter the details of it, we need to look at how those pieces fit together. You can see on the right side of the screen the outline of the reign. It's really just 9 chapters from chapter 3 to chapter 11. Let's just go over that briefly before we look at some questions to consider, so you can see what the range of elements are, as I was just suggesting. So in the beginning are 2 strange stories, and many modern commentators don't treat them as strange, and yet they are, and I'll show exactly why today, and then we'll look at them in more detail. But first, he dreams of Yahweh giving him the ability to discern between good and evil. And it's an incredibly convenient dream, as we'll see. What else would a young person, he describes himself as a small child, we don't know how old he is, but however old he is, he's inexperienced, and he dreams that Yahweh gave him power. And what could be more obvious than that? But is it true, or is it just a dream? And then after that, as I was noting, his famous wisdom scene where he judges this maternity suit. But everything about it says we should read it allegorically, as we'll see later, although even though I took that view when I wrote my book, Come Out My People, which I wrote that section on in 2007, published in 2010, I've updated with modern scholarship and not seen that anybody else has read it that way, so you'll have to decide for yourself. Then we have a rather cold list of his officers who are assigned, among other things, to be in charge of the forced labor and to extract food from the various farmers around the land to give it to Solomon and his house. Then the summary of his dominion and provision and the summary of his wisdom, which we'll see comes from Adonai and not Yahweh. Then, out of nowhere, he seems to make a covenant with King Hiram of Tyre to provide materials and workers for the house of Yahweh. And I didn't notice right away, but in the very beginning, as you can see on the left side of the screen, the first thing we hear is that he made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, which raises all kinds of questions we'll look at in just a minute. Then he builds the house of Yahweh, otherwise known as the temple, but it's not called that. It's called the house of Yahweh, over the course of 11 years, including 7 in the building. Then he keeps building and brings in Hiram of Tyre to do the interior decorating. And we'll see the interior decorating is a combination of the Phoenician style of Hiram and Egyptian style. Then he assembles the leaders to sacrifice countless sheep. Countless are described there later. They're described as 120,000 sheep and 22,000 oxen, and they hold a festival. And then Yahweh appears to him for the second time and offers a conditional promise to maintain Davidic rule forever, following up on what we saw in 2 Samuel 7. Solomon and Hiram settle their payments to each other, with Hiram seeming disgruntled a little bit. Then there's the account of Solomon's forced labor and the fact that he built a navy in Edom and Hiram's people joined it. Then, near the end, the Queen of Sheba comes to marvel at his fame, and we hear all about his gold and riches. Silver was as nothing in the time of Solomon. They ate on gold plates. And then finally, there's a critique of Solomon's foreign women who, quote, turned away his heart from other gods. And Yahweh speaks to Solomon a prophecy about the kingdom's removal. 2 adversaries are raised up, and finally he dies, and his son Rehoboam succeeds him. And we might wonder then, if he has 1,000 women, why is there only one apparent son? So that's just a brief sketch of some of the questions. Let's look at some in some more detail here. So first, what is the relationship between these chapters and the David story that precedes it and the rest of 1 Kings that follows it? We can read it naively and just the end of 2 Kings and the beginning of 1 Kings as if it was all written in sequence, but it plainly was not, and scholars still argue about it. And many books have been written about this, and I'm not going to try to bore you with details. Frankly, I think they've argued about it so long and reaching no conclusions that might lead you to suggest that the argument isn't going anywhere or it's not solvable. But here are some of the questions. And it matters for how we interpret it, because the question of when it was written is related to question 5, is the story pro-Solomon or anti-Solomon? Everyone agrees that chapter 11 is anti-Solomon. It openly criticizes him for worshiping other gods. But I'd like to suggest, depending on the criteria we'll use, that we'll look at in a minute, we can find that there's no praise of Solomon here at all, or at least not much praise amidst the other things. So when was it written? People like Brooke Halpern, who I use much in my David series, still argue that it was at the time of the succession that is to justify why Solomon is king. But that view has been challenged by many, and the common scholarly view is it was written much later in the time of King Hezekiah in the 8th century BCE. One of the arguments for that is there are questions about whether Hebrew script, the actual writing script, existed before the 8th century. But one has to ask, if the story was from the 8th century and was just made up, a fake past, then Israel seems to have no past at all, because at the time of King Hezekiah, the Assyrians come down and destroy something called Israel. So there has to be some backstory of Israel and some backstory of Judah, and that would argue that it's at the time of the succession. And we'll look more at the details as we go. But others suggest at least parts of it, and certainly parts of it were written at the time of King Josiah in the 7th century BC to justify what's called Josiah's reform, which is really an act of destruction and murder of anybody who doesn't celebrate Yahweh in Jerusalem, which is what he's trying to do. You can call that reform if you like, but we'll look at it more closely eventually when we get there to 2 Kings 23. Or during exile as a reflection on monarchy as a whole. And there's no question that 2 Kings doesn't end until exile, and so at least some of it was written then. Did somebody in exile go back and rewrite pieces of it? That's a question we have to look at. And it's not resolvable, but we'll see. There are clearly parts that are from the time of King Josiah in specific language that's from the book of Deuteronomy, which most scholars would agree had its original form in the time of Josiah as a second law. That's what in Greek Deuteronomy means, is second law. So it could be some combination of that. So that can be confusing. As we work through this, I'll try to do it as simply as we can and just let you know the choices. But mostly I'm trying to read the story as it is, but we do have to look at that question. Can we discern one section from another in terms of time of composition? In other words, is the entire Solomon story written at one time, or can we suggest that parts of it, like chapter 11, but maybe other parts, were written at other times? And again, we'll have to look at that. How are we to see Solomon's, and I put it in quotes here, empire, because it's not actually called an empire, but it claims broad sovereignty, so that's easily what an empire is. How are we to see Solomon's empire of Israel and Judah in relation to other powerful nations? And the first thing we see here is the alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And scholars who take Exodus as already written at this time, which I'd like to suggest, and I did in Come Out My People and in Creation or Empire, as absolutely not the case, that the book of Exodus is written exactly to counter the narrative of David, Solomon, and Rehoboam. And we'll look at that just a little bit today, but we'll look at that more as we go. Look at it more as we go in the chapters on 3 and 4, because I can tell that this is already going to be a while, and we're just introducing the themes. So the question of Egypt, is it an ally of Solomon, a colonial overseer, or a competitor? We'll look next time, when I look at the overview of these chapters, about how shocking it is that the first thing that he says is done is make a marriage alliance with Pharaoh. Why would Pharaoh want to make a marriage alliance with this puny little kingdom here in Jerusalem and environs? That's a question we'll have to look at. But we can see that Egypt actually plays quite a role in the story, and I color-coded it 3 ways. The ones that are in pink are Solomon and Egypt. The ones in orange are Exodus recalls, suggesting a Deuteronomic insertion from a later time. And the blue is Solomon's opponents in Egypt. And I won't go over these all in detail, but you can see at the beginning in these opening chapters, we see what I was just noting about Pharaoh's daughter. Then we see this incredible claim that he was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt, which is certainly historically not true for any sovereign from Jerusalem, but there it is. And that his wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. So in both these examples about his sovereignty and his wisdom, suggesting he's the greatest king everywhere from what's now Iraq to Egypt or Babylon at the time. Then, in orange, we see this whole series, and mostly in his temple dedication speech here, where we see this constant refrain, they came out of the land of Egypt. But as we'll note later, one thing that's never mentioned is Moses. There's no mention of that at all. There's just this phrase, they came out of the land of Egypt. There's not even an explanation of why. Moses is mentioned here in passing, but not as a leader. And there's no sense of what the problem was exactly. It simply says the midst of the iron smelter, but there's no Exodus story, as you will. Moses is also mentioned here. I shouldn't say he wasn't mentioned. That was wrong. But there's not much about him, just a couple things in passing. So when we get there, we're going to read that as an insertion from later to try to situate the story of the dedication of the temple in the narrative as the later authors understood it. But if we'd known about that at the time, making a marriage alliance with Pharaoh would certainly seem like treason of some kind. So we'll have to look at that question. And then we'll see in Further, that Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it down and killed the Canaanites and given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's woman, or wife, as it's usually translated. So working for Solomon, in a sense, or at least working for his daughter there. And then we see the refrain several times, remembering that Pharaoh's daughter was there. We saw it at the beginning. We saw it in chapter 8 here, made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. We see it again down here, that Solomon brought her up from the city of David to her own house. And then we'll see it one more time here, that he loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh. Plus, we'd heard that he imported horses from Egypt, which will play against Deuteronomy 17, as we'll see when we get to that section. So then we hear that Yahweh raised up adversaries against Solomon in the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, borrowing from the Persian, Satan, which would be a royal official who's been sent in to spy on people. Is that what's happening here? We'll have to look and see whether Hadad is working for the Egyptians to spy on Solomon or looking to undermine him on behalf of Egypt and Pharaoh. But we see this little story here, which I reproduced the whole thing of, that he fled to Egypt, and Pharaoh gave him a house and gave him a sister-in-law for a wife. And then when he wants to leave, he said, "What do you lack in me that you go back to your own country?" And he insists on going, much like Nehemiah does in the book of Nehemiah to the Persian king. And we can look at that at another point. Then Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam, who's the second adversary that came up. And I didn't mention that story because it wasn't directly about Egypt. But it says it here. Jeroboam, like Hadad, fled to Egypt, to King Shishak of Egypt, and remained there until the death of Solomon, when he came up and led the rebellion against Solomon's son Rehoboam, as we see here. Then we'll see that he made his so-called golden calves, recalling that they're the ones who brought you up out of Egypt. And we'll have to look to see whether that's really something from Jeroboam or that's a slur on behalf of the Jerusalem-centered writers. And then finally, outside the frame of the Solomon story, in the 5th year of his son, King Rehoboam, King Shishak, the same one that we saw earlier up here, came against Jerusalem and took away all the treasures of the newly built house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house and brought it all away. So something went on to make King Shishak upset there. But we see that throughout Egypt is there from the very beginning to the very end of Solomon's reign. So we really have to look at what's going on there with Solomon at the time. Then we'll see Hiram of Tyre. And David befriended Hiram of Tyre, but Tyre is a major part of the Phoenician kingdom of Tyre and Sidon to the north, a nautical kingdom, and had much treasure. And so why would Hiram want to help Solomon do this? And he not only helps him, it's quite a deal. He'll end up with 20 cities as payment for the materials and the workers to build these houses. And so we'll have to look at the relationship there. And what about the indigenous Canaanites? Well, at least according to Joshua, we're supposed to be conquered but weren't completely. But what's the relationship with those people of the land? Are we supposed to understand that they're this toxic enemy, as we see in Deuteronomy and Joshua, or otherwise? And then we get to the question, is the overall story pro or anti-Solomon or some combination? And I just want to go through these briefly. We can see what's at stake in the dating of the story. If we take the narrator's evaluation at face value, we get things like this at the very beginning. So in the dream, we hear this. Solomon said to Yahweh, "You have shown great and steadfast love," chesed, the key attribute of Yahweh to human beings, "to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness," or in truth, "in righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you, and you have kept for him this great and steadfast love and given him a son to sit on his throne today." Who believes that? Who is meant to believe that David walked before Yahweh in faithfulness, righteousness, and uprightness? Do I need to make here a list of his adultery and his murder and his deception and all the other elements that are plainly not compatible with anybody's version of Yahweh? Whether that's a religion of empire or religion of creation, whether that's some other text as critique like Exodus or whether it's Deuteronomy, David plainly was not Mr. I'm faithful to Yahweh. In fact, he never is said to love Yahweh. He's never said to love anybody. And so it starts off with that kind of propaganda that ought to be a simple, wait a minute, are we supposed to take this at face value or not? At least that's how I read it. You can read it exactly the way it reads, though, that God is doing this and that Solomon is God's man in Jerusalem. But if we compare to other kings described in 1st and 2nd Kings, we'll hear that the narrator tells us that Josiah was the greatest of all time, that none were before or after as great as him. So how do we balance that? We can go back to 1 Samuel 8 when the people wanted a king in the first place, and Yahweh told the people via Samuel the king will take, and that's exactly what Solomon's doing, starting with taking the daughter of Pharaoh, but also taking food and other things from people. We can use Exodus to do it, whereas I wrote in Come Out My People and in Creation or Empire, I suggest that the three pharaohs in the Exodus story, the one who knew Joseph, the one who knows Moses at first, and the one who Moses goes to after that one dies, represent in order David, Solomon, and Rehoboam. And Jeroboam will represent Moses, so if we read it that way, Solomon comes out exactly like Pharaoh. Similarly with Deuteronomy 17, which is not anti-monarchy, but it's plainly anti-Solomon. In a passage in 17:14-20, every element describes Solomon exactly and nobody else in the monarchy. So certainly Deuteronomy 17 wants to bring the memory, the good memory down on Solomon. Or we can use it in Genesis 2 and 3, because we'll see in the dream, we see on the left side, he'll say, what I need to govern your people is the ability to discern between good and evil. And if we knew the book of Genesis, wouldn't that be the classic original sin, to be asking for exactly what was prohibited in the garden and what led the man and the woman to be expelled from the garden, the knowledge of good and evil? And that's certainly one of many pieces of evidence that Deuteronomy was written way after, certainly at the time of exile, if not in the Persian era after that, and certainly not only contrary to Solomon, but utterly anti-monarchy and anti-urban life altogether. Or do we use a more recent analysis, what I call the religion of empire versus the religion of creation, to evaluate monarchy, or Jesus to evaluate Solomon, who says, both in Matthew and Luke, when people are anxious about what they should eat and drink, consider the lilies of the field. Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed as one of these. So quite a diss to say that the most glorious king who ate on gold plates and had visitors from around the area was not as much an expression of God's glory as a flower. In the end, what is Solomon's wisdom? We'll hear that his wisdom is telling proverbs and knowing all about animals and all kinds of things, which is a traditional Eastern wisdom. But is that really why this story is being written? I'd like to suggest now, and we'll show it along the way, that his wisdom is exactly what his son lacked, how to hold these two different peoples, Israel and Judah, together as one nation. And they come apart immediately, because as soon as he's dead, the people of Israel come to Rehoboam and say, your father was harsh on us. So it's another basis for judging that even in the pro-monarchy and pro-Jerusalem texts of the Deuteronomistic history, they admit that the people of Israel found Solomon's reign harsh, even though the narrator will tell us in chapter 4 that all Israel was happy and under their vines and fig tree, the classic image of peace and prosperity in the Hebrew scripture. Consider finally what's not narrated. Solomon never goes to war as any military battle of any kind, and we don't know how long he lived in that, although we hear a general number about it. Where did the wealth come from to pay for these enormous expenses? And I mean enormous, 120,000 sheep. The amount of food that we'll see is required every day is beyond comprehension. Where is all that wealth coming from? What's his relationship with his family? We saw him get rid of Adonijah, but he has other brothers. He has, as we'll see eventually, 1,000 women. Does he have any relationship with them or children who aren't even named? We saw every one of David's children named and the women they were associated with, but all we'll hear about is Rehoboam, and we don't even know who his mother is, and we don't hear about any siblings at all. Nor do we know what he looks like or how old he is, which of course doesn't stop artists from making pictures of him. But David we knew was tall and beautiful and all those kinds of things, but the author doesn't tell us a thing about Solomon. So those are just some of the things we have to look at as we begin our journey through this, and we'll start next time with an overview of chapter 3 and 4. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.